Archaeologists have confirmed an image of a sailing ship painted at a rock shelter in West Arnhem Land is Australia's oldest dated contact art. The painting was dated as part of research into relationships between Southeast Asian seafarers and Aboriginal people in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Archaeologist Campbell McKnight is returning to Arnhem Land for the first time in more than 40 years. He worked here at Anuru Bay in the 1960s, studying a bygone era when macassars sailed from the island of Sulawesi to Australia's north coast to fish for trepang, a highly prized delicacy in parts of Asia.
Trepang was Australia's first modern industry. The first thing that Australia had, which the rest of the world wanted.
Prior to the European settlement of Australia in the 18th and 19th centuries, Indonesian fishermen and traders from the islands of Sulawesi, Timor and Aru would sail to the northern coasts of Australia to fish for pearls, turtle shells and sea slugs during the monsoon season. These sea slugs were known as trepang, hence the mariners who fished for them were known as trepangers. The annual maritime harvest collected by the Indonesians would be taken back to the Sulawesian port of Makassar, from whence it would be exported to China.
The Indonesian trepangers, often generically referred to as macassars, used to come here to the coast of Darwin at this time of year during the monsoon.
The Southeast Asian trepang industry intensified during the 18th century, driven by the demands of the growing Chinese economy further north, and by 1800 there were up to 1,000 Indonesian trepangers plying the northern coasts of Australia. These visiting sailors traded with the Aborigines and frequently employed them for harvesting, and sometimes even married local women. The Indonesians were mostly Muslim by religion, and in the course of their dealings with the Aborigines of Northern Australia, several tribes acquired Indonesian Islamic influences in their customs and beliefs. The Indonesian trepang industry officially ended in 1906, when the British enforced an embargo against foreign boats fishing in their Australian territory. Given the Muslim identity of the Indonesian trepangers, some modern Muslims, driven by identity politics, promulgate a series of common myths pertaining to the nature of Indonesian Aborigine relations. It is sometimes claimed that the Indonesian Muslim trepangers discovered Australia prior to any European explorers. The Indonesian Aborigine relationship was mutually beneficial, or at least not detrimental, and Indonesian Aborigine relations were benevolent, peaceful, and friendly. The alleged excellence of Indonesian Aborigine relations is lauded by some modern Muslims vis-a-vis the tragedy of British Aborigine relations, thus bolstering, in the minds of such Muslims, the moral superiority of Islam over the evil, destructive, imperialistic West.
The Macassans were Indonesians, many of whom were Muslims who were in contact with Aboriginals via trade routes hundreds of years before the English arrived in Australia. And it's funny that the Muslims must have seen the Aboriginals in their rawest form, practically nude. No evidence suggests that the Muslims requested the Aboriginals change their customs, and the Macassans traded with the Aboriginals peacefully for hundreds of years, with no colonization or oppression. How hypocritical for you to blame Islam for the degradation of a people, completely ignoring that your Western democracy is 100 times worse than Islam in regards to the destruction and annihilation of a culture.
Putting aside the gross simplicity of reducing a collection of cultures, the Indonesians, to merely their religious identity, i.e. Muslims, and putting aside also the false comparison and false dichotomy between a religion, Islam, and a nebulous civilization, the West, there are several problems with the ideologically driven narrative of exceptional, beneficial Pacific Muslim Aborigine relations. Firstly, it is completely inaccurate to claim that Indonesian Muslims discovered Australia prior to any Europeans. The earliest available solid evidence for the Indonesians in Australia dates to the mid-1700s, whilst the Dutch had unquestionably discovered the continent over a century prior, by at least 1606. Archaeological evidence does suggest that the Indonesian trepangers were possibly present in northern Australia as early as 1664, but this date is still several decades subsequent to the first confirmed European landing in Australia, There are even some indications that the Portuguese may have discovered Australia during the early 1500s, but certain European contact was established by 1606 at the latest. In other words, it is not really accurate or factually substantiated to assert that Muslim Indonesians discovered Australia prior to the Dutch, given the current lack of evidence for such an assertion. If, however, a pre-European, i.e. pre-1606, Indonesian discovery of Australia is assumed, and not unreasonably, given the close proximity of Australia to Indonesia, then it was a discovery assuredly made by the pre-Islamic Indonesians. The inhabitants of Sulawesi only converted to Islam in the early 1600s, at around the time when the Dutch had definitively located Australia. It would be arbitrary and baseless to assert that the unrecorded, literally prehistoric, Indonesian discovery of Australia occurred within the tiny window of time between the Sulawesian conversion to Islam in the early 1600s and the confirmed Dutch discovery of the continent in 1606. Instead, it is far more likely that Australia was known to the inhabitants of eastern Indonesia for many centuries prior, long before the religion of Islam filtered into the region. This supposition is confirmed by the curious case of the dingo, which originated in Southeast Asia and was introduced to Australia between 5,000 and 3,500 years ago, demonstrating that trade and travel routes likely existed between Australia and Indonesia during antiquity. Secondly, it is highly inaccurate to characterize the historical Indonesian Aborigine encounter as beneficial for the latter, when the full implications of said encounter are considered. In the course of their travels along the northern coasts of Australia, the Traepangers from Indonesia accidentally brought with them a host of deadly diseases, to which the Aborigines had no natural immunity. In the 1830s and the 1860s, outbreaks of smallpox in northern Australia, introduced by the Indonesian Traepangers, devastated the local population. Contrary to popular misconception, the overwhelming cause of death for Aborigines in early modern Australia was not the predations of murderous British settlers, but instead the lethal diseases that ran ahead of their settlement, especially smallpox. Many modern historians now surmise that the great pan-continental smallpox epidemic that decimated the indigenous population of Australia in 1789 originated with the Traepanger fleets from Indonesia, although this is still contested. It remains certain, however, that the Indonesians infected at least the coastal tribes of the north with lethal diseases, ravaging the local population. According to the anthropologist, historian and expert on the historic relationship between Indonesians and Aborigines, Ian McIntosh, in an academic article on the subject, quote, "An unreported consequence of Makassar, i.e. Indonesian, contact is the extinction of Aboriginal clans and the dispersal of others brought about by introduced diseases like smallpox and internecine conflict arising from the shock of the new," unquote. Just as the British introduced smallpox and other diseases to the eastern seaboard of Australia, so too did the Indonesian Traepangers spread the same maladies to the northern shores of the continent, felling the Aborigine populations of Arnhem Land, the Kimberley, and possibly the entire continent. In addition to smallpox, the Indonesian Traepangers also brought with them other social ills, such as tobacco, alcohol, and probably opium, which have proven highly detrimental to indigenous societies. Moreover, Aborigine women were often sold by indigenous traders as chattel, i.e. sex slaves, to the Indonesian sailors. One could hardly describe such trafficking as beneficial or positive, at least for the women involved. And now the final question. Was Indonesian Muslim contact with the indigenous tribes of northern Australia friendly and benevolent? Before considering the nature and temperament of Indonesian Aborigine relations, it is worth considering the cultural context of eastern Indonesia, particularly the island of Sulawesi, at the time. The substantial spread of Islam to Sulawesi only occurred at the very beginning of the 17th century, when the Portuguese were active throughout Indonesia. In 1605, the king of Luwu officially adopted Islam, as did the rulers of Teo and Goa, i.e. Makassar, with drastic results. Quote, "In conformity with Islamic custom, Makassar invited surrounding kingdoms to accept Islam. When their rulers refused, a series of campaigns was launched, known locally as the Islam Wars. By 1611, all southwest Sulawesi, including Makassar's Bugis rival, Bone, had become Muslim. Only the mountainous area of Toraja did not succumb, primarily because the people here saw Islam as the faith of their traditional enemies. In 1618, Makassar undertook the first of several attacks on the island of Sumbawa, to force recalcitrant local rulers to accept Islam. By the 1640s, most neighbouring kingdoms had accepted Macassar's overlordship and with it the Muslim faith, unquote. In other words, the Muslims of Sulawesi were just as aggressive and intolerant as every other culture in history, and one would expect their interactions in Australia to be nuanced and complicated accordingly. In many areas of northern Australia, the Indonesians certainly maintained friendly ties and respectful relations with many indigenous tribes, but this was not the whole picture. As per usual, the truth is more complicated. From 1751 to 1906, the British in Australia actually documented Indonesian Aborigine relations, particularly with customs records, as did the Indonesians themselves on some occasions. Despite the romanticised memory of the Indonesians that many post-British Aborigines now entertain vis-à-vis the trauma of British colonisation, history records many episodes of bloodshed and violence between the Trepangers and the natives. In an academic article on the subject of historical Indonesian Aborigine relations, Regina Ganter aptly noted the following, quote, "Whereas indigenous people tend to remember harmonious relations with Macassans, i.e. Indonesians, the documented historical record suggests quite a different contact history, punctuated by violent encounters that had to be settled through the intervention of white, i.e. British, officialdom," unquote. The Aborigines of Groote Eylandt were known to be extremely hostile towards the Indonesian sailors, due to the fact that the latter, quote, "stole things from them, enticed them to drink, beat them when they would not work, and abducted Aboriginal women to take back to Macassar," unquote. Early Dutch records tell of hostility between the Indonesians and the Aborigines, and of the latter killing several of the former. The British explorer Matthew Flinders encountered an Indonesian Trepanger fleet in 1803, and wrote in his travel notes that the Indonesians reported that they, quote, "sometimes had skirmishes with the native inhabitants of the coast," unquote, warning Flinders to, quote, "beware of the natives," unquote. Archaeological remains, i.e. defensible sites, left by the Indonesian Trepangers in the Kimberley from the early 19th century indicate the hostility that existed between the foreign sailors and the local Aborigines during that period. British records from the late 1800s chronicle the exploitation and abuse of Aborigines at the hands of the Indonesians, not to mention the latter's introduction of diseases to the former and the Indonesian practice of paying indigenous workers with alcohol despite being Muslim. These were ostensibly contributing factors to the 1906 British implementation of an embargo against Indonesian fishermen in Australian waters. In general, most Aboriginal hostility towards the Indonesian Trepangers arose from the latter's lack of respect for, i.e. rape and abduction of, Aborigine women on numerous occasions. Evidently, the common myths promulgated by some modern Muslim ideologues are historically unfounded or highly inaccurate. Muslim Indonesian explorers did not predate Christian European explorers in their discovery of Australia, given the proven 1606 Dutch contact and the certainly pre-Islamic provenance of any prior Indonesian explorers. Indonesian Aborigine relations were not overtly beneficial, given the spread of deadly diseases from the former to the latter. And finally, Indonesian Aborigine relations were not overtly friendly, given the recurring history of violence and hostility between the two. As the Australian philosopher Denise Russell once noted, it is inaccurate to characterise the historical Indonesian Aborigine relationship as either friendly or hostile. As noted above, the truth of the matter is considerably more nuanced than the simplistic propaganda narratives promulgated by certain partisan interests.
When it isn't being hijacked by politico-religious ideologues, the story of the Indonesian Trepang industry in northern Australia is a fascinating and little-known episode in Australian history.
And the story continues. To this day, sailors from eastern Indonesia continue to fish, legally and illegally, for trepang along the coasts and waters of northern Australia, following in a maritime tradition unbroken for centuries.